Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Chinese economy, and specifically the solar panel industry, because what was once one of the fastest growing parts of the Chinese economy is now crashing down. In the last 12 months, the combined results of all of the solar panel businesses has been $60 billion worth of losses. And we're seeing lots of companies now becoming insolvent, going bankrupt, closing down, and laying off staff. And this is a nightmare for the Chinese economy because lots of these companies have got lots of debt. This is basically the same as we've seen with the property sector and lots of other industries in China. They take on lots of debt, they grow rapidly, and then they realize they can't pay the debt back and they become bankrupt. Now, before we get into the details on all of this, I'd like to ask anybody that isn't a subscriber to please smash that subscriber button now, because I know that more than 50% of people watching this channel aren't subscribers. It doesn't cost you anything. It's not really a subscription, but it helps me. It makes me feel happier, but also it helps me with the YouTube algorithm. So if you could smash that subscriber button now, I'd really appreciate it. Now, in terms of what's going on in solar industry across the globe, this chart shows the countries with the top 10 solar PV capacity installed. And not surprisingly, China is right at the top of this list. It's one of the biggest countries in the world. It's got 1.4 billion people. I know a lot of people don't agree with that, and you can send me a message if you like. And it's actually been at the forefront of installing solar capacity. And you can see that it holds around 40% of the total amount of installed capacity. The United States is the second largest country with solar capacity. It's holding around 11%. Now, interestingly, when you look at the percentage of electricity generated from solar, for China, it's 12%. For the USA, it's only 5%. India comes in at number 3. It's generating around 7% of its electricity from solar, and that equates to around 4% of the global capacity. Japan, number 4, it's at 10%. It's in double figures for the percentage, but only 3.5% of the global capacity. Germany comes in at number 5. It's got 14% from solar, but actually that rises to 32% during the summer period, and that's 3.5% of global. Brazil is also in double figures at 10%. Australia has 8%, Spain 12%, Italy 11%, and South Korea 12%. But the whole point of this chart really is to show you that China is right at the forefront of solar installation, but more importantly, it's also at the forefront of solar production. And we'll go on to talk about that in more detail in a moment. But before we do, I'd like to talk to you about today's sponsor, investing.com. Now, if you follow the channel, you'll know that I'm an active investor, and I like to do lots of research and make sure that before I put any money into any stock, I know that I've got a good chance of making a profit. So I like to do lots of research and lots of analysis. And investing.com gives you a huge database of analysis. You can basically look at any company in the world and get the full details. You can get investment bank level analysis on the investing.com website. And it also gives you lots of ideas. If you're thinking about you want to make some investments, but you're not entirely sure what you want to do, you can look and get lots of different information. So this table here, you can click to look at what the biggest billionaires in the world have in their portfolios. So you can copy those if you like. Or if you want to see what the hedge funds are doing, you can get the full breakdown of where the hedge funds have invested their capital. Or if you're interested in activist investors, so these hedge funds that are trying to do things with certain companies, they take positions on boards, those sorts of things, then you can see that full breakdown as well. So investing.com gives you the tools to be able to deploy your capital most sensibly. And the great news is that they've extended their summer sale. So you can get a 50% discount on a subscription, plus an additional 15% for being a Joe Blogs viewer. So if you're interested in that offer, please click in the link below. Now, in order to put into perspective the sheer dominance of China's position in the solar panel industry, I thought it was worth having a look at what's been happening in the USA over the past 6 years. And you can see that dating back to 2019, the US at that time had installed 13.5 gigawatts of capacity in that year. That rose to 19.8 in 2020, 23.6 in 2021. We then had a reduction in 2022 mainly as a result of the problems caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. So there wasn't enough equipment going around at that point. And then we saw a real ramping up in 23 when 39 gigawatts was installed, a further ramping up in 24 where it hit 50. And so far this year, we're on a run rate of around 43, but that might increase depending on what happens through the rest of this year. But interestingly, when you look at the volume of installations compared to the amount of equipment that the USA is importing, there is a big difference. So this chart shows those two figures. The yellow line here plots the amount of US solar installations, and they're the figures we've just talked about. And then the orange dotted line shows how much the US is actually importing. And you can see that bizarrely, it's importing more than it's installing. Now, the reason for that is there's obviously a delay when you import all of the equipment. You then have to find your installation, you get all your approvals, you get somebody to pay you, and then you go and put the installations in. So I think the point of this is that this is not a homegrown industry for the USA. In fact, the vast majority of everything that's being installed into the US in the solar market is being made overseas. Now, in terms of the question of where is it being made, this chart shows the top 10 countries that produced solar equipment in 2024. And as you can see, China is right at the top of this list, having produced 80% of everything that was made globally. Now, Vietnam, Malaysia, and South Korea are second, third, and fourth here. However, some of these companies in Vietnam, Malaysia, and South Korea are actually Chinese businesses that have manufacturing facilities in those countries. So there was actually an investigation under the Joe Biden administration as to whether or not the imports from Vietnam, Malaysia, and South Korea were actually just Chinese companies that were exporting via a different country. And there was actually a big investigation on whether or not there should be tariffs. There was a pause put on any tariffs from those countries that expired in 2024. And that actually marked the start of the downfall of the Chinese solar industry. But carrying on down this list, you can see that the USA comes in at number 5 in terms of global production, but only 1.9%, which is the same percentage as India at number 6. And we've then got Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, and Laos at the bottom. So I think when you take a step back and look at this, you can see that the vast majority of countries on this list are low labor cost economies, but China is completely dominant. It's got more than 80% of the global market share when you take into account that the Chinese companies are operating in other countries. Now, in terms of what's happened over the past 5 years, there have been 3 different parts to this cycle. Between 2020 and 2022, which was obviously interrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw rapid growth in the Chinese solar industry, and over 300,000 jobs have been added over the past 14 years. And we've got some really large companies. So Jinko Solar, for example, turned over at its peak over $16.7 billion. So some very large businesses. Now, in terms of how much profit these businesses are making, well, they operate on very thin margins. So even though Jinko Solar turned over 16.7 billion in 2023, it only made a profit of 486 million. And actually, if you look at what happened in 2024, it didn't make any profit virtually. Now, in terms of the whole of the sector, that's been the underlying problem. As the companies have grown and the industry has got larger and larger, there's been a lot of price competition. So everybody wants to be the cheapest producer. But the problem with that is that you tend to lose your profit margins and therefore you end up making no money. And that's not a good position to be in. And you can see here that in between 2020 and 2023, there was some profitability. 23, things were starting to improve slightly. But in 2024, things have not gone well. And the reason for that is because we've got overcapacity. These companies have grown too rapidly. They're producing far too much equipment, and the world can't actually cope with the volume of solar panels that are being produced. You can't install them quickly enough. People are not moving rapidly enough to solar in order to take up all of this production. So if we look at what happened in 2023, that was the turning point. And then 2024, we have seen this industry starting to collapse in China. So it's been reported that 31% of the workforce, 87,000 jobs, have officially been cut in 2024. And the biggest companies are really starting to feel the pain. So Jinko Solar basically made no profit, even though it's turned over 12.6 billion. It's just not making any money. And that's not a good position to be in. If you're having to run at that pace, turn over $13 billion just to break even, then clearly something's gone wrong. And as I mentioned at the start of today's video, it's estimated that the losses in the industry in China are now around $60 billion. So what are the reasons? Why has this happened in China? Well, the first issue, as we've just alluded to, is overcapacity, because this industry geared up for the rest of the world to be installing solar panels at a very rapid rate. But unfortunately for China, that hasn't happened, because whilst everybody has the desire to move to solar, for certain reasons, it's just not happening at the same sort of level. Because the problem with solar is that obviously it's a bit more seasonal, and also it doesn't work during the night. So you get great power during the day when the sun's shining, but once the sun goes in, then you need to have other sources to be able to supplement what you're doing. Now, you can store some of the energy with batteries, but the technology on that hasn't really grown at the same sort of rate as the production for these solar panels. So countries are installing solar, but not at the rate, anything like the rate that China was hoping that they were going to. So they're producing too much for the global demand. And because of that, with simple economics, we know that if supply outstrips demand, then that brings prices down. And we've seen a complete collapse in prices. So over the last 12 to 18 months, prices have halved for this industry. And clearly, if you're a business, you're working on the assumption that you'll probably be able to keep selling your products, maybe at a slight markup, maybe you'll get 1 or 2% inflation uplift, but you're certainly not working on the assumption that you'll be selling your product for half of what you were selling it for this time last year, because nobody can operate under that model. It's basically loss leading. You're having to give away things, hoping that you'll make some sort of profit down the road. And what we're seeing in China is that many of these businesses are now making huge losses. And what can you do? You can't increase your prices, because if you do, then somebody will just buy from your competition because of the overcapacity. So they've made a rod for their own back. They've got too much product. Nobody wants to buy it, and so they're having to cut the price. And that's making things worse. And so everybody's cutting the prices. And so it's become a real cutthroat market. But on top of those problems, the Chinese businesses have made a real big problem for themselves by taking on huge amounts of debt. Now, this is something that we've seen before in China. If you follow the channel, you'll know that when I first started making videos about China, we were talking a lot about Evergrande and all of the other companies that were involved in property development. And the problem that those companies had was very similar to this. Firstly, they overstretched themselves. And secondly, they took on too much debt. And then ultimately, that debt caught up with them. They couldn't repay the interest. They couldn't make any of the repayments. And so a lot of those huge property development companies have now gone bust. And that's what we're now starting to see in the Chinese solar panel industry. So it was recently reported that over 40 companies have had to delist from Chinese markets. So they've taken the shares off the market. They've defaulted on their debt, and they've gone bankrupt, and they're having to lay off staff all over the place. And this is now becoming a really vicious circle, because as more and more of these companies go bust, that's leaving all of their capacity, all of their stock. Somebody's coming in and buying it very cheaply, and so they can sell it cheaply to make a profit. That's pulling down prices even further. So the whole industry is over leveraged. It's got too much debt, and sales are falling. There's no profitability. They haven't got any cash flow to repay the debt. And so it's likely that a lot more companies are going to go bankrupt over the next 12 to 18 months. And just to make things worse, the markets that China have been selling into have decided to push back. So the USA, over the last 12 months or so, before Donald Trump's tariffs, actually introduced a 50% tariff on Chinese imports of solar products because of anti-dumping. They basically said that China was making too much of this and then flooding the US market, which would put all of the US companies out of business because the prices were so low. So to avoid that, they introduced a 50% tariff. Now, that 50% tariff is now higher because Donald Trump has introduced his reciprocal tariff. So we've got another 30% on top of that, possibly another 10% for being in BRICS. So that would take you to around 90% tariff, which is similar to what we see on electric vehicles coming in from China. They've got 100% tariff plus the reciprocal tariffs. So the US has been quite penal on China, as has India and the European Union. So China has found that it's not been able to access all of those markets, certainly not at the right price, because of these tariffs. And what's happened is Chinese companies have had to swallow some of that tariff, and that's made the situation worse because that means that they're getting less revenue. And the other issue that China has encountered is volatility in demand in the key markets, because whilst China has been installing solar very rapidly, it's not been happening at anywhere near the same pace in other countries because it's not a massive issue. Most countries don't have solar as their first choice. There are lots of other alternatives such as wind, geothermal, and hydroelectricity, as well as nuclear. So whilst China would love everybody to be installing solar, it hasn't been happening. And when we have volatility in terms of what's going on in an economy, then solar panel installations probably get put to one side. And the other issue that we've got with China is this race to the bottom, where all of the companies have been trying to undercut each other in price. That's just driven down revenue and caused lots of them to be unprofitable, and many of them are now going bankrupt. So in terms of summarizing the situation in China, we've seen the loss of over 87,000 jobs in the last 12 months. The industry has banked a $60 billion loss, which is not sustainable. That's in addition to all of the debt that they've got in place. So that's just an actual loss. In terms of repaying that debt, it's impossible if you're making losses. More than 40 companies have been delisted and gone bankrupt recently. And we've seen some of the biggest companies in China now posting zero profits. So all of this is adding up to an absolute nightmare from China's point of view. And in terms of how do they sort it out? Well, it's going to be very, very difficult because demand isn't going to change overnight. You've got all of this overcapacity, all of this oversupply. The prices are now rock bottom. So the industry is completely bust. And it's likely that China is going to have to just wear this. Lots of companies are going to go bankrupt. And this could become the new property sector in China. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we've talked a lot about the property sector in China, which did contribute around 25% of the GDP, so it is an important sector to talk about. But over the last 10 years, we have seen the rapid expansion of the solar panel industry in China. It's the market leader globally by a long way. It produces more than 80% of all solar panels that are installed everywhere. And China basically decided that it was going to become the leading expert. So a lot of the technology has been developed rapidly in China. It's got these huge factories that it's built, and the government has been subsidizing this industry heavily. It decided that it was going to take that market leading position. But the problem that China have encountered are multiple because, firstly, the overseas markets didn't take up the demand as rapidly as China was hoping to. They were hoping that everybody were going to get to a situation where 40% of their electricity would be generated by solar. But that just doesn't really work for most countries because solar, in terms of comparing it to other forms of electricity generation, is relatively inefficient because it only works when the sun is shining. So for some countries, that's a limited amount of time in the day. Also, in the winter periods, for a lot of countries, the sun is quite weak, and so it doesn't generate anywhere near the amount of electricity that it would do during the summer. And in terms of being able to store the electricity whilst it's being generated during the day, not many countries have huge battery capability to be able to store it up and then release it through the night. So solar isn't right at the top of many countries' lists in terms of which form of electricity they should be using. So The demand hasn't been there, but also from China's point of view, the problem that they've encountered is that many countries accuse China of dumping this equipment, basically overproducing and then trying to flood the market to kill all of the local competition. So we've seen countries like the USA, India, and the European Union introducing penal tariffs to basically raise the price of Chinese imports to try to protect the local markets. So China wasn't really anticipating that was going to happen. But also, it's been self inflicted because these companies, whilst they've had lots of grants and government investment, which is one of the reasons why they can produce all of this equipment so cheaply, they've also taken on huge amounts of debt, hundreds of billions of dollars. And this is a story that we've seen before in China with the property development companies. These companies grow rapidly, they have top line sales, which looks very healthy, and therefore the Chinese banks give them hundreds of billions of dollars worth of debt. And then they realize that actually it's a very competitive market because they've been undercutting each other. Prices have been slashed, they're down by 50% in the last 12 months. And when you get to the bottom line, there isn't any profit left. So you might be turning over $10 billion, but not making any profit. And the problem with not making any profit is that it means that you don't have any cash, and therefore you can't pay the interest or the repayments on your debt. And at some point, the banks will say, well, we need to be repaid. If you can't repay us, we're going to make you bankrupt. And that's what's been happening in China over the last 12 to 18 months. We've seen multiple businesses, some of which are very large, becoming illiquid and going bankrupt, and over 87,000 people have been made redundant. And it's likely that that situation is going to get significantly worse over the next 12 to 18 months because we're now seeing the fruits of everything that has been sown. The industry has completely collapsed. It's got right to the bottom in terms of pricing. We've got huge overcapacity. There's not enough demand to take up all of the equipment that's being made, so prices are being slashed further. That's cutting profit margins to basically zero. Nobody is making any profit, and the Chinese banks are sitting with all this debt that is never going to be repaid. So what we have here is an industry that's in freefall, it's crashing, and we're going to see lots of failures going forward, and that's going to put even further pressure on the Chinese economy, which is already struggling to achieve its 5% growth target for 2025. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, really appreciate that. And if you've signed up either as a Patreon or a YouTube member or Buy Me a Coffee member, thank you for that long-term support. Really helps to keep me motivated, and here's something to put a smile on your face.